Good evening, one and all present here. Um, we are here for the 8-week live interaction session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. The course instructor is Dr. Harshit Sosan Lakra. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. We have two of these sessions happening per week, live interaction sessions. One is a session by Ms. Isha Rathore on Saturdays, usually from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. She is a PMRF and research scholar at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Roorkee. The second session of the week is by me. I'm Monica S. I'm a PMRF and research scholar at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning at IIT Kharagpur. Excuse me. Yeah. So this is a collaboration between NPTEL and PMRF. As PMRF, that is Prime Minister's Research Fellowship, is a merit-based fellowship given to PhD candidates in select institutions across the country. So, as part of the fellowship, we are required to teach in a local college or an institution. So, this tie-up is to facilitate us and give a venue for PMRF to sort of fulfill our external teaching requirement. So, since nobody has joined, I'm sort of recording this for people who are going to be checking it out on YouTube. I'll be admitting people as and when they join. So for those of you who are online, I think this doesn't apply, but whoever will be joining online. So we have two main streams of instruction for this course. One is the doubts and interaction session during the weekly live sessions, which is every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. You can, after every question or every few set of questions, I'll prompt, but even otherwise, you can raise your hand, unmute, and raise your query. Questions can also be posted in the chat box. The other major avenue for interaction for this NPTEL course is the discussion forum. Any questions related to the live sessions conducted can be raised there. Any questions related to the course actually can be raised there. So those questions will either be addressed in the forum or in next week's live session. So an outline of the session. So we'll have a very short, very brief recap of what was taught in week 8. And then we will be looking at week 8 assignment questions from the previous run of the course. We'll be looking at the answers and have discussions regarding the answers and probably often a few explanations as and where required. Then we'll be moving on to week 8 assignment questions from the current run of the course. So here again we'll be discussing answers and explanations will be provided. So additional content has been added throughout as and where I thought was necessary. Some of them might actually be mildly repetitive or might have been covered partially in one of the previous live interaction sessions. So they're not going to be entirely covered here. Excuse me. So yeah, so wherever that happens, you will actually see a card on YouTube towards the right top. Or I will also be telling you, I'll be mentioning that this part has actually been covered previously as well, or that additional content or more content can be found in the previous lecture. So as and where I can, I'll probably add the YouTube card or a prompt here, a link to that video, so you can check that out as well. But even otherwise, there have been a few queries in the discussion forum regarding some of the answers that have been given as part of the answer key for the current assignment. Those clarifications have also been given in this lecture. Whenever this happens, you will actually see a prompt towards the top right of the slide mentioning that it is actually a query on the discussion forum. Okay, so going for a short recap of the week's course contents. Excuse me. Yeah, so is internet working? Okay. Good evening, sir. I've already started with the introductions. I'm just about to start the recap for the week, just to keep you updated. So, going for a short recap of the week's course contents. So, week 8 was a continuation of environmental impact assessment methods. So, lecture 36 sort of uh, was the second part of climate and climate change. 37, 38, and 39, all three of these dealt with EAA methods regarding ecology. 37 dealt with definitions and concepts, 38 with baseline study, and 39 with impact prediction and evaluation. Lecture 40 was about ecosystem services, part 1. The part 2 will be dealt with in the next uh, week. So, in lecture 36, which was the second part on climate and climate change. We saw scoping and baseline studies. So we saw scoping for climate change mitigation, baseline studies for climate change mitigation, scoping for climate change adaptation, and baseline studies for climate change adaptation. We also saw impact prediction and evaluation, impact of the project for climate change mitigation, climate change impacts on the project and on receptors, interaction between climate change mitigation and adaptation. In lecture 37, which was the first lecture on EAA methods for ecology, which dealt with definitions and concepts that will be important to be understood for understanding the rest of the three. So we saw definitions, we saw the concept of key factors of ecosystems, we saw the concept of ecosystem resilience, we saw the concept of habitats and the concept of species populations. In lecture 38, EA methods for ecology dealing with baseline study. First, we defined the baseline study. We defined the baseline in scoping. Then, within defining the baseline, we saw two different ways of actually defining the baseline. One would be the desk studies, and the other would be surveys. We saw methods and levels of study, resource requirements and timing, initial baseline surveys. Detailed surveys and evaluation of baseline conditions was the last part of the lecture, where we saw sampling purpose and options, plant surveys, animal surveys, habitat surveys, environmental variables and site history, changes without the development, description and evaluation of the baseline conditions. Lecture 39 was the last lecture on EA methods for ecology, where we saw impact prediction and evaluation. Uh, there were sections on impact on ecology, different guidelines, methods for flora and fauna separately. So for flora, we saw samples plot method, transects and line intercepts method, plotless sampling method. And for fauna, we saw the species list method, direct contact methods, count indices method, removal methods, market capture methods. And we also saw the testing of significance of the impact. In lecture 40, which was on EAA methods for ecosystem services, this is part one of a series of uh, lectures dealing with ecosystem services. So first we saw an introduction to ecosystem services, then definitions and concepts. We saw ecosystem, natural capital, and ecosystem services. ecosystem service benefits and beneficiaries, valuation of ecosystem services, ecosystem service demand and use, ecosystem service supply and access. Then the last part of the lecture was on key interrelationships between ecosystem and ecosystem service supply, use, demand, and benefit. So before we move on to the questions, uh, were there any queries in general, apart from those that have already been raised in the discussion forum? There have been three queries regarding assignment questions from the current run on question number 6, 10, and 14, I think. So those will be dealt with in this lecture later. But apart from that, are there any queries? All right. If there are no immediate queries, let's move on with the questions. Yeah, you can also bring up queries during the session, or towards the end of the session, we'll again have a discussion. Excuse me. Yeah. So looking at the previous round week 8 assignment questions, whatever questions are dealt with here, which are also part of the current assignment, they will not be explained again in the second half. So yeah. So question number 1, what is the acronym of NDC in relation to climate change policy frameworks? Option A, national development contributions. B, naturally determined contributions. C, nationally determined contributions. And D, nationally democratic contributions. Any responses? Please give your answers in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself and answer as well. That works too. Any responses? All right. So this is the slide from the lecture that deals with that sort of mentions nationally determined contributions, right? So or NDCs. So why are they called nationally determined contributions? Because as part of the framework, each nation is supposed to give. Uh, so what happens is usually a baseline is set or a target is set uniformly for all countries, and it so happens that compliance with such standards are always falling short. So because an external agency is sort of giving that threshold or a target, um, or whatever contribution each country has to give, they often feel discouraged. They Several factors are not being considered, and there is a uniform blanket or a few categories at max, right? So this concept was sort of evolved towards that, where nationally determined contributions uh, sort of permit each country to determine their own contributions, as to they will say, okay, you know what, this is what we are going to do towards climate change. So in that way they can sort of take stock of how much they are capable of without compromising too much on their development, without stunting their growth, because there is obviously a difference between different countries in terms of the kind of economic achievement that they've attained, right? So the so-called developed countries are in a better position to contribute to something like climate change, whereas again so-called developing or so-called underdeveloped countries, they're sort of struggling to even establish themselves due to various reasons. I mean, most of them historically quite significant. So because of this, uh, they if the same cap was given to a developed country and a developing country, then it sort of stunts the developing country's growth. It also permits or sort of places a social obligation or a collective obligation on the developed countries to do more towards climate change, because they seem to have benefited more, right? And uh, leaving other countries to suffer, mostly because they're capable of mitigation, right? So here the answer is C, nationally determined contributions. uh, this is a slight repeat from week three's lecture, right? So we saw how if the climate pledge, so if we do nothing about climate change, then this is sort of the gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, so it will be quite high. And then with climate change pledges, whatever the countries have given as their, nationally determined contributions, taking all of that into consideration, we'll reach here. However, the target of the Paris Agreement is to keep the temperature rise to 2 degrees, right? Like to limit it by 2 degrees. If we really want to do that, then contributions sort of have to belong to this level, right? So right now, although it's somewhere in between, we are still falling short of achieving. The second concern is whether we'll even achieve this part. Like, yes, the countries have pledged this much, but will we actually comply with those is another question, right? So this is sort of the status of ratification. Four countries have signed the agreement, but they have not really joined it. So they're not really obligated, you know, to follow through. However, 192 parties have joined the agreement. It's actually three countries, if I'm not wrong. I think one more country has joined it, right? So this climatewatchdata.org hosts a lot of data regarding uh, climate and climate change, and all the conventions and the legal uh, clauses that are going on. So you can take a look at it later, right? So when we look at whether we are on track to reach the Paris Agreement goal, we're sort of here, right? These are the reach somewhere between this range if the governments follow through the pledges, and this is the range, right? Our target. So this was again a video regarding nationally determined contributions. So I've given the link here. Let's take a look again.
What are nationally determined contributions? The Paris Agreement empowers countries to limit the global average temperature increase to as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible, to strengthen climate resilience to achieve Paris
Okay, for some reason the audio isn't working. So
climate resilience and ensure financial flows are consistent with these goals. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, form the basis for countries to achieve Paris Agreement objectives. What are nationally determined contributions?
I hope that's better now.
What are nationally determined contributions? The Paris Agreement empowers countries to limit the global average temperature increase to as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible, to strengthen climate resilience and ensure financial flows are consistent with these goals. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, form the basis for countries to achieve Paris Agreement objectives. NDCs embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. They communicate the ambitious efforts that a country will undertake to address climate change. NDCs are nationally determined so that countries can put forward the most ambitious contributions that their national circumstances allow. NDCs contain information on targets, policies and measures for reducing national emissions and on adapting to climate change impacts such as floods or droughts. Some NDCs also contain information on either the needs for or the provision of finance, technologies and capacity building to enable ambitious climate actions. Countries communicate new or updated NDCs every 5 years starting in 2020. In doing so, they follow guidance adopted in Katowice in 2018 on information to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding of NDCs. Subsequent NDCs should be more ambitious and not backslide to lower ambition. This is how, at a global level, our actions become more and more ambitious towards reaching the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Communicated NDCs are recorded in a registry maintained by UN Climate Change.
So that's a video on nationally determined contributions at their very basic level. I hope I'm audible. All right. Pardon me. One second. Okay, so I don't have access to the chat box right now. So in case you have any queries, please raise them in person. There's some issue with the internet here. Right. So this is India's updated first nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, and we have these 8 major clauses. Right. So you can go through them at your convenience. So moving on to the next question. State true or false. Scoping in and scoping out with respect to climate change in the EAA process mostly depend nation to nation base mostly depend nation to nation based on their legislative provision. Is it true or false? There's been one answer, and you're right, sir. The answer is actually true. So, ma'am, there is no explicit slide on this, but ma'am actually talks about how it depends on each country's legislative provision. Right? So, moving on to the next question. Select the following issues to consider in scoping for climate change adaptation. So, we have 4 options. A, nature of the project, its location, and resilience to climate change. Climate related parameters likely to influence the project. Anticipated changes to those climatic parameters over the life of the project. Or D, all of the above. So, what are the things that we consider in scoping when it comes to climate change adaptation? Any responses? So, this is question 3. Okay. We have, yes, sir, you are right. So, the answer is all of the above. So, this is the slide that deals with this. So, these are the issues to consider whenever we are doing scoping for adaptation, which is climate change adaptation. Applicable regularity and legislative requirements, nature of the project, its location and resilience to climate change, duration of the project, climate related parameters likely to influence the project, anticipated changes to those climatic parameters over the life of the project, sensitivity of the environment potentially affected by the project is to those is not that to those climate parameters. Right? So the answer is all of the above. You are right. Okay. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following information are considered for baseline studies for climate change adaptation? So now we are looking at baseline studies. So previously we saw scoping, now we're looking at baseline studies. So A, historic or past climatic conditions. B, current conditions at the time of the assessment. C, future climatic conditions, medium and longer term. D, all of the above. Any answers? Excuse me. Okay. Okay, let's see what the answer is. The thing is, I know you usually baseline studies are assessments of the existing conditions usually. However, when you look at climate change adaptation, the potential for climate change adaptation also like depends on the current conditions, but also the future climatic conditions as well. So I understand why the natural guess would be to go for this or a combination of these two, but the answer also includes future climate conditions, right? So in order for you to determine what is the current adaptation potential of the site, we need to look at what is the climatic condition going to be naturally, of course, without the project, right? So that is the baseline study. So climate changes baseline studies are slightly different from what usually happens, say, with water or air. But the answer is actually all of the above. Any queries regarding this? I hope that's clear, like why we are looking at future also for a baseline study. All right, moving on to the next question. Match the following terms of group A with their description in group B. So we have four terms: ecology, ecosystem, habitat, and biotype. So, and our group B gives you four options. So, any responses? You can give me partial answers as well. Okay, I've again lost access to the chat box, unfortunately. I'll check here. Okay, so I guess that's for question five, right? The answer is C. Let's see what the answer is. So these are the slides sort of dealing with uh, these terms, right? So ecology is the study of ecosystems, habitats, communities, species. It actually ecology involves the study of interactions between these two, the relationship between these. So ecology involves those as well. Excuse me, 1 second. The next term we have is ecosystem, where ecosystem is a self-sustaining functional system consisting of physical, chemical, and biological attributes. So it's a combined entity. So it's not a standalone thing. Then habitat is conditions needed to support a species or community of species in a particular location. So a habitat can include either the conditions needed to support a particular species or a community of species, right? Species is like one particular species. Community of species is a group of species that live in a particular area. So here is what a community of species in a habitat, groupings of different species that have evolved in ways that facilitate their coexistence and regularly and recognizably occur together. So it might so happen that there might be some incidental, communities, but those are not sort of notified or considered as community of species. This term is specifically for those groups that are usually recognized together, right? And usually these end up forming a food pyramid of sorts. So they belong to multiple levels and they form a system naturally, right? So one sort of becomes the prey for another. That's how nature systems work, right? And the next one is biotype. Actually, if I'm not wrong, this is biotope. So it's not biotype. I will get back to you with this. I will probably contact the team. I haven't contacted the team yet regarding this. So this is a biotope, not a type. Yeah. So a biotope is the environment typically supporting such a specific recognizable community as is given here, right? However, except this part, everywhere else it's mentioned as biotype. So I'll try to get a clarification on this. Right. So when we look at this, here the study of ecosystems is obviously ecology. Right. Ecosystem itself is it's a self-sustaining functional system consisting of physical, chemical, and biological attributes. So it's not just you know the biological part. Sorry, ecosystem. A habitat is the conditions needed to support a species or a community of species in a particular location, and biotope is environment typically supporting a specific recognizable community. Right. So the point is a habitat, biotope is also a habitat. So habitat could have both. Uh, I think I have a slide on this instead of writing. I think it will have both species or a community of species, right? But a biotope is only for a, community of species. So the answer is actually B. So P3, Q1, R4, and S2. That's your answer. Any queries regarding this? All right. So let's look a bit more into these concepts, right? So uh, a bit of an extra explanation to sort of retain stuff. So there is actually a game also even called Biotope. It's an aquarium simulator. So something as basic as an aquarium could be called a biotope. Why? Because there are several species present. You have plants, you have different types of fish. Of course, this is an artificial biotope, right? So this is basically the equilibrium that is expressed in this particular simulator. It's available online on the Steam platform. It's just something interesting that I came across when I was looking for an illustration for biotopes. But more specifically, a biotope is an area of uniform environmental conditions providing a living place for a specific assemblage of plants and animals, right? So, this assemblage is the key. It is an English loanword derived from the German biotop, which in turn came from the Greek bios, which means life, and topos, meaning place. Biotope is almost synonymous with the term habitat. So, the thing is, usually they're interchangeably used in some places, but scientifically, like in a lot of countries, they are distinguished as different. So, for a habitat, the subject is a population, right? It's the conditions required to maintain a population. But a biotope is a biological community. What is the difference? A population is just the same species. It cannot be an individual. It has to be a group of individuals. A community is when multiple species sort of live in the same area, right? So this is sort of a hierarchy of things. So we have individuals. Several individuals of the same species comprise a population. Several populations comprise a community. An ecosystem is not just species, it's also the physical and chemical attributes, if you remember. So it's community plus physical and chemical attributes, right? A biome is a much larger area, right? And then a biosphere sort of considers everything, including human beings, right? It's basically the that part of Earth where habitation occurs. That's a biosphere. So an ecosystem, like we saw, is a particular set of conditions where physical, chemical, and biological attributes which sustain, you know, which sort of comprise the environment everywhere. So that's about it. So I hope these things are clear. The difference between a biotope and habitat is very, very mild. Like they're almost synonymous, right? I hope the explanation clears things up. Are there any queries? I hope not. So moving on to the next question. I'm sorry, I don't have access to my chat box on my phone. There's some issue yet again, right? So question number 6. Match the ecosystem resilience attributes given in group A with their elaboration given in group B. So we have four terms: stability, fragility or sensitivity, resilience or recoverability, and recreatability. Any answers? You can give me individual answers as well. Okay, we have one answer. Let's see what the answer is. Right. So, all right, let's see the first point. Ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance without crossing a threshold to a different state, usually degraded state, right? So let's actually go ahead and look at the slides. I have a bit of additional explanation also to give. So there are, all of these are actually components of ecosystem resilience, right? As has been mentioned in the question as well. So stability is when changes over a time are within normal bounds of variation, right? It sort of resists any kind of environmental change. That's stability. So there is a range within which normal variations can occur, but this range is considered stable. Any fluctuation within this, we don't consider it as fluctuation at all. Like we consider that, the environment there is stable. Fragility or sensitivity is the ecosystem susceptibility or weakness towards environmental pressure. A fragile ecosystem is more easily altered and may lose its ability to recover from impacts more easily than a stable ecosystem. So, say a stable ecosystem is something that's not so easily affected by external change or is not in the way of it for that matter. So, say a particular ecosystem's range is, you know, range of fluctuation is quite high, which means, and say it is here right now. So, the amount of change that it can sort of take is quite large versus an ecosystem where the range is quite small. This is the amount of fluctuation that it can tolerate. Say there is some pressure of this magnitude, this will be a stable ecosystem, right? But this won't be. So this one is relatively more fragile or vulnerable compared to this one, right? So then we have resilience, the ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance without crossing a threshold to a different state. So the thing is, even if this normal range is surpassed, right? Beyond this point also, this system might be able to absorb this and come back to this state, right? So it can sort of take this much pressure and it does not become some other ecosystem, right? So it's virtually synonymous with stability. So stability is a normal range. Resilience is when the system sort of, highly resilient system is sort of the counter term for vulnerable system, sort of fragile system, right? Recoverability is the ecosystem's ability to return to a pre-disturbance state. So this come back part is called recoverability, right? These are all overlapping terms. Do not expect them to be, understood in isolation to each other. So this particular term, however, is ability to return to a pre-disturbance state if the disturbance is removed. An important aspect for EAA short-term impacts, such as in the construction phase of a project. So, say during construction, a particular ecosystem's state changes. It might, it should be able to recover once the construction is, done and the project is in place. Recreatability is potential for re-establishing an ecosystem of richness and complexity, similar to the ecosystem that has been destroyed. Say you end up actually destroying an ecosystem, can you actually recreate it? It's literally that, right? Recreatability. So here our answer is for ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance without crossing a threshold. So that's your resilience. Like I said, recoverability is the ability of a system to come back, right? So it essentially absorbs. State in which changes over time are within normal bounds of variation. Whenever you see this term, so that's stability. Then we have potential for re-establishing an ecosystem of richness and complexity, similar to the ecosystem that has been destroyed. So this is re-establishment. So it's recreatability. And then we have ecosystems susceptibility or weakness. So that's fragility or sensitivity, right? So we have P2, Q4, R1, and S3. So that's the answer is C. You were right, sir. Your answer was right. So, so this is sort of a schematic taken mildly out of context, but if you remember, say this is the resilient phase. So say we are somewhere here right now, right? There was some point at which the particular ecosystem that we are in has formed, right? This point is a threshold. So the previous state was something else. So this is the previous state of existence. At some point, the ecosystem came to its current stable state. So what happens is because of natural processes like succession, succession is when or a marshland grows into a forest, say, or due to natural human disturbance. So we have natural ecosystems happening, we have urban ecosystems happening, agricultural change happening. Because of all this, what happens is no matter what the ecosystem is staying in its current state, right? It's not really becoming some other ecosystem. So this is the stable state of the ecosystem. But however, again, if we reach a particular threshold, it might end up becoming a different ecosystem, right? So these are sort of to again explain. So this is the external pressure, the environmental pressure, right? So say this is the normal state. So no matter what happens, pressure happens, this line is sort of not, that's a resilient ecosystem which is stable, right? And here, if it ends up actually falling, this ecosystem, if it ends up actually, you know, sort of crashing it with very low pressure, that's low resistance, low resilience, right? So here it ends up, again crashing with high pressure. So right, medium resistance and low resilience. Here it has high resistance. This is the first system. So no matter how much pressure the system is in, it's sort of remaining stable, right? It's remaining within this. That's a high resilience system. Here we have low resistance but high resilience. So what is happening is when some pressure comes, the system drops. But after the pressure disappears, right? After this point when the pressure disappears, it comes back. If you remember, resilience and recoverability are connected. Here again, medium resistance. It is somewhat not trailing off course like this system, right? It's not as bad as this, but nonetheless, it is returning to this part. So these systems are crashing, which means they are they have low resilience. These systems, this one, they are crashing, but they're recovering, right? However, this one is not crashing at all. It's sort of remaining within a range. I hope that explains it. Any queries? All right, moving on to the next question. What do you determine in the scoping stage for EAA method for ecology? So, A, study area, B, survey methodologies and assessment methodologies, C, key ecological issues to address, or D, all of the above. Any answers? Let us keep the question here. We have two answers, and both of you are right. So, these are the things to determine in EIA methods for ecology. So we need to look at study area, survey methodologies, assessment methodologies, and key ecological issues to address. So the answer is all of the above. Moving on to the next question. State true or false. Valued ecosystem components. One second. Valued ecosystem components are the species, habitat, or sites that qualify in terms of their ecological or conservation value or socio-economic value. Is it true or false? Any answers? Excuse me. Okay. Both of you are correct. So this is the slide that sort of gives you this answer, right? So that is true. So let's take a closer look at what these valued ecosystem components are. So in general, in any kind of settlement or any environment, we have, so this picture is actually taken slightly out of context. It's for a particular project, right? So they're talking about two types of valued ecosystem components, but don't worry about it. So this is their project's VEC, and these are the other possible VECs outside that project. So this is the link in case you want to take a look at this one. Uh, this particular is the budget you get. I'm not sure. Sound nearshore partnership ka VEC, right? So I'm just using the image as an example. So we generally have a set of social systems, right? Our ethics, our cultural values, our aesthetic values, our spiritual values, several sets of values, our economic values are sort of in place, right? And then there is an ecological system that exists. So there is an overlap between these two, right? So whatever we do to conserve this, the components that are there as part of ecological systems that we want to conserve because they're valuable to us. So this part, whatever is valuable to us is sort of referred to as valued ecosystem components. The thing is, usually these are obvious, right? These are important for the ecological system as well as social systems. So there might be aspects which are outside the social system but might still be valued ecosystem components because there's some sort of indirect value that we're getting from to the social ecosystem usually. Even otherwise, there is a new domain of ethics that sort of says that it's the responsibility of human beings to not destroy our environment, right? So those are these VECs, right? However, like, what are VECs? What is an valued ecosystem component? It's easier when you look at it look at the difference between ecosystem components and ecosystem services. Right? So for an ecosystem, say an ecosystem is a beach, right? What all services does it give us? It gives us recreation, it gives us fishing, gives us sand supply, gives us shorebird habitat. So a particular recreation service, a particular service can be given by several systems, right? So this could be a beach, bay, coast, forest, park. So this is a valuable ecosystem component. It's a VEC. Why? Because it gives us several services. One service can be given to us by several systems also, which means all of these are VECs too. It depends on where our value systems lie, right? So we can designate a particular beach as a valued ecosystem component because we really value its services. It's one other way of sort of bringing several domains into conservation. That's all. So a VEC can be several things, right? It can be a species, it can be a habitat or a site. So in this one, it is sort of a site or a habitat, right? Any queries regarding this? Okay. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following are the simple techniques used for ecological survey? A. Ecologist field walking and visual assessment. B. Recording. C. Thematic mapping. D. All of the above. Any responses? Okay. All right. Both of you are right. It is all of the above. Right? So this is the slide that sort of deals with lists of simple techniques. There are more complex techniques as well that are listed later, but these are the simple techniques that are used for ecological survey. So this is the answer is all of the above. All right, before we move on to the next question, let's take a short break of 5 minutes. Meanwhile, I'll try to recover my Google Meet on my phone so that I can take a look at answers more easily. So we'll meet at around 7:06, 7:576. Thank you. All right, resuming with the session. Moving on to the next question. Habitat that supports a community which contains a large proportion of non-native or introduced fauna and flora. So that's the key, right? Non-native or introduced flora and fauna, where human activities have modified the area's primary ecological functions is called A. Natural habitat, B. Modified habitat, C. Critical habitat, or D. None of the above. Any answers? Okay, we have one answer. Any other answers? You are right, sir. So it is a modified habitat. So uh, modified habitat basically includes areas such as like agriculture, parks, amenity areas, commercial forestry and plantations, reclaimed or modified wetlands and rivers as well, right? So the answer is B. Yes, both of you are right. So the thing is, whenever there is a natural habitat, there are several ways of, the habitat becoming modified, or there are there being a loss of habitat, right? So we can have some sort of direct loss where like there is a change of structure itself. Say we uh, sort of induce the need for physical space or a productive space, right? This is sort of repetitive, but yeah. So, however, there can also be indirect loss where like we can result in climate change. Therefore, the habitat is getting modified. There could be pollution. Therefore, the habitat could get modified, or some invasive species might result. Invasive species are those species which do not belong to a particular area, but uh, not all species are really considered invasive species. So these are called alien species. But whenever they sort of take over the local resources, say there is a new tree that is introduced somehow due to some sort of development in an area, say there is some artificial uh, forestation effort, afforestation effort, or something like you end up carrying some seed from somewhere and then you introduce an invasive species in a particular area as artificially. What happens is rather you introduce an alien species, some of them might end up taking up so much resources that the local species start end up being deprived of resources. It might even lead to extinction of the native species or the original species that were there, right? So this could also happen, and eventually it could lead to habitat loss. But these are like, it's a gradation. It need not be a like a full habitat loss, like habitat loss as in a particular species dying away, right? So this is a particular paper, just to illustrate. So here they're talking about amphibian tolerance to anthropogenic habitat modification. Anthropogenic, why? Because we are modifying it. If it's happening naturally, there's not much we can actually do about it. But this is human modification of environments, where the amphibian they're talking about here are frogs, right? So there are species within frogs which are less tolerant, and there are species that are more tolerant. They found that in this particular study area, 70% of the 87 species that they studied are intolerant of human modified habitat. So all of them would end up dying away, right? We'll end up losing those species, and say they are present only in this particular area, we'll actually end up losing them completely, right? They might end up being extinct. So, however, some of them do not really. So, this is a modified habitat. Within this modified habitat, some might end up still surviving, right? So, this is a study that was conducted in Australia. So, I hope that's a modified habitat. So, despite modification, say some species, some rather large group of species, they might actually survive through also. Like this is a particular study, right? I hope that's clear. Large landscape project, agricultural activities, plantation projects. Yes, sir. Yes, absolutely. These are all modified habitats. Yes. Okay. Moving on to the next question. Identify the method as shown in the image, which is used for impact modeling of flora. So, is this sample plot method, transects and line intercepts method, plotless sampling method, or species list method? Any answers? Okay, we have one answer. Sorry. Any other answers? All right. So this is actually coming from this slide on impact modeling of flora. So this is the transects and line intercepts method, right? So the answer is B. So this is an illustration of all the transects methods. So you don't have to remember all of them. It's more to sort of help you remember line intercept method, right? So there is usually some measure, some tape measure, or some sort of distance measure. So this is like the base, right? This is what we use to measure. Within that, at particular distances, if we find out what species is there, like say after so many meters, after 10 meters, what is the species? After 10 meters, what is the species? If we do it like this, so this is an illustration using corals, right? Coral reefs. But every 10 meters, if we do it, that's a point intercept transect, right? However, say these dotted lines are the line intercept. So we start measuring, and then we see till how much distance is this particular species there, right? So till here you have branching coral, branching hard coral. Then you have plate hard coral, right? Then you have some sand, which means there is no species in this particular area. Then you have boulder coral. Then again sand. Then branching hard coral. So this is a line intercept. So we sort of determine the proportion using this. A chain intercept is when you sort of look at a continuous. So here it's actually written wrong. It's CIT, the chain intercept transect. Records the number of chain links covering each object. So this one is a particular complete chain, right? It's one chain. Here, for example, this is a best illustration. Here, in a line intercept, we sort of look at this whole thing as one, right? However, in a chain intercept, we'll be like, okay, this is a different chain, this is a different chain, because these are two different chains, right? It might be of the same species, but so what we are talking about here is this one, right? I hope that sort of illustrates how this is done. So, say you have like a forest or a bunch of trees, right? For a single transect line, what you do is you travel through this and you start marking, right? You end up detecting trees and then you mark them. You can have a multiple transect line also. So you might end up missing some of them. So you have several transect lines going through this and you mark the trees. So this is the line intersect transect method, right? So transects and line intersects method. I hope that's clear. All right. Moving on to the next question. Match the following methods for impact modeling of biological environment given in group A with their application given in group B. Right? So we have four of them. Sorry. Species list methods, count indices methods, or roadside or aerial count methods, removal methods, or plotless sampling methods. Any answers? Partial answers are also welcome. Okay, okay, correct. Okay, so we have one answer. Let's take a look at the slides, right? So first one is species list method. So you basically make a list of species, right? Although this is given for fauna, we use these for flora as well, right? Flora is plants and trees, fauna is, or it could be a collective term also. Say when you say gut flora, you sort of refer to bacteria essentially, right? So yeah, so here we make a list of animal communities observed directly or whatever species. Directly, we end up making a list. For count indices method, what we do is we drive past them, like usually trained observers do this, and they count, right? So you count all the animals that are passing a fixed point. This is the alternative. So you either stay stationary and then you count how many are passing by, or you drive past slowly so that you end up, you know, even if the animals are moving, you end up counting them properly, right? There is no double counting. Removal method is when you sort of capture a few of the species, right? So you sort of have to uh, it's like a sampling, right? So you remove them from the site. And plotless sampling method is when you don't really you use distance as a measure. So you take a particular sampling point and then you measure the distance of a particular species from this point. But what is the point of determining this distance? We actually figure out the density from this. So that's the main criteria. This will be explained a bit more in a later question, right? So the answer is actually D. Sorry, there is a typo here, right? So we have species list method is correct, right? P4. Count indices is when driving them past, like driving past them rather. So then removal method is you capture and then figure out. Plotless is when you take the mean point plan distance. So you don't have a. This is sort of counter to plot-based method, both of which I'll explain slightly later. Right? So going for the next question. State true or false. Market capture method is one of the methods for impact modeling of fauna. It involves capturing a portion of the population and at some later date sampling the ratio of mark to total animals caught in the population. Is it true or false? Okay. Any other answers? You are right, sir. It is true. So the thing is, this term, I'm not sure if this is correct, honestly speaking. However, India's EIA guidance manual mentions this, right? It's not a mistake on the lectures or the content part. The guidance manual, if you remember, ma'am had taken it from the thermal power plant guidance manual. So it mentions market capture method, but I am not sure of it could be mark and capture. So this is just something to keep in for all purposes, for all examination purposes, please use market capture because that's what's mentioned in the manual released by the government of India, right? However, it could be mark and capture or like mark, release and recapture. So what happens is you sort of mm, capture a few animals, mark them and release them, and then you recapture them. So that's how you estimate. There are particular formulae that you use. There are models that you use to, from this number, you can determine the total population, right? We estimate the total population. So the answer is true. It is one of the methods to for impact modeling of fauna. Right? Okay, moving on to the next question. Match the following terms of ecosystem services in Group A with their description given in Group B. So we have natural capital, final services, intermediate services, and beneficiaries. Any responses? Okay. Okay, let's see what the answer is. So a natural capital is actually a stock of living or non-living environmental resources potentially available to generate value. So it's sort of a stock, like as in there is like how we use the term stock normally. So it's available and it's potentially available, like you can use it to generate value, right? So that will be natural capital. Final services is for the benefit to well-being, right? Like it provides direct benefit. Intermediate services, indirect benefit. So when it's not like directly, say some sort of recreation is a final service from the environment, but say for example here, hay production for supporting livestock production is an intermediate service. So it's sort of more relatively difficult to identify, right? Beneficiaries are, so this one is again missing from the set of slides that have been given. It's present in the lecture though, the video though. So beneficiaries are people who derive benefit from an ecosystem service, right? They could be individuals, whole communities, or particular groups within a community, right? So the answer is actually B. So we have natural capital is rather direct benefit to human well-being is final service. People who derive benefit are beneficiaries. Stock of living and non-living environmental resources potentially available. So that's natural capital. Here we have contribute indirectly to human well-being. So that will be our intermediate service. So P3, Q1, R4, and S2. Right. I hope there are no queries regarding that. Moving on to the next question. Match the following terms of ecosystem services in Group A with their description given in Group B. We have uh, a set of four. One is use shed, ecosystem service demand, ecosystem service use, and ecosystem service supply. We have demand, use, supply. Any responses? Okay, since this is a match the following, let's go ahead and look at the slides, right? So, ecosystem service demand is the level or amount of ecosystem service desired by beneficiaries. So, people want something, right, to fulfill their requirements. But when this demand is met, so people have a particular demand, say they want 10 things, right? And the environment is, from the environment, they end up getting six things, say, right? So, this part, the realized demand is use. So they've gotten what they wanted, but the one that is left out is still just demand. They have a demand for it, but it's not really being met, right? So ecosystem service use is level of a particular ecosystem service that actually consumed or enjoyed the beneficiaries. So this part, right? Whenever a demand is met, it's use. Use shed is the area people use for getting a particular ecosystem service. So say there is a community here, like do they take ecosystem services from the entire world? No, there'll be an approximate region from which they end up gaining this ecosystem service, right? So, for example, an area from which a community collects firewood, for or a river catchment from drinking water, right? So, river catchments will naturally be larger than a firewood area. So then service supply is when maximum amount of service that can be drawn. So if you remember, this is the demand, yes, this is how much we ended up getting, but how much can the environment provide? So say the environment can provide only this much. There might be some that are still not being used for other reasons. People have a demand, there is supply, but maybe they're not able to get it, they're not able to access it, right? So that's the accessibility part. So maximum amount of service that can be drawn from an ecosystem without damaging its future productive capacity. So that's the key term here. You can also call this as maximum sustainable yield. Right? If you end up damaging the ecosystem, then that's not really good for future use, right? We're reducing the capacity of the ecosystem. So this supply will depend on type or condition or health, and it'll be affected by how the resources are managed. So here we have maximum amount of service. So how much can be drawn? So this is the supply part. Area people use. So this is the area, right? People use for getting a particular ecosystem service. So that's use shed. Level or amount of ecosystem service desired by. So this is what people want. It's the demand, right? And level of a particular ecosystem service actually consumed or enjoyed. So this will be your use. So it's P2, Q3, R4, and S1, right? I hope that's clear. Sorry. So this is just an illustration of what I had said. So people want this red circle, right? So, and then this is realized supply. So this green part is use, right? This is supply. So supply could also have components. So this is missing in this particular diagram. Supply could also have components that are not being used. So that is ecosystem service access, right? Or due to some other reason, it's not being used. Maybe we'll end up completely destroying the supply if we end up using it beyond the threshold. Maybe. Okay, so let's move on to the current and week 8 assignment questions. Three of these were queries raised in the discussion forum also. Okay, so I'm avoiding overlapping questions, so the question numbers will be a little off. Question 1 has already been dealt with. Question 2. Select the COP meeting by which India aims to reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by less than 45% until 2030. So COP 23, 24, 25, or 26. Any answers? Okay, we have two different answers. One of you is correct. The answer is actually COP 26, right? So India sort of presented a five-fold strategy. We are calling it Panchamrita after the mm, edible products that we sort of get as prasad from temples usually, right? So we have these five strategies. You can see India will reduce carbon intensity of its economy, right? 45%, right? So that's COP 26, right? So in COP 26, we made these five pledges, right? But uh, the top three emitters, which is China, US, India, of course, we are trying to become carbon neutral by 2070. However, China has not announced new pledges by COP26. They had previously pledged net zero by 2060. So that's like 10 years before us. United States has sort of cited domestic legislation to spend 555 billion to boost renewable energy, renewable power and electric vehicles. They have pledged net zero by 2050. So these are the major outlines of what other countries have pledged. Right? They might have made other pledges as well. But apart from these pledges, we also sort of brought a few things to the fore. First is that India, despite being 17% of the world's population, our emissions are only 5% of the world's emissions, right? India is fourth in installed renewable energy capacity. The Prime Minister also highlighted how Indian Railways is to become net zero by 2030, which is quite ambitious, right? And we initiated the International Solar Alliance. So this is mostly for targeted at countries where there is high potential for solar energy harnessing, right? So it's an initiative by India, and we also created a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. So these are things that were also highlighted about uh, India at COP26, right? Moving on to the next question. What is the full form of UNFCCC? United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UN Framework Conference on Climate Change, United Nations Framework Classification on Climate Change, or United Nations Framework Committee on Climate Change. Okay, we have a couple of answers. The answer is actually A. So, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Please remember this, right? So, it's this UN FCCC will is sort of going to occur time and again in all these this entire course and even outside of the course, right? So it's actually a convention on climate change. Okay. Moving on to the next question. Match the terms given in Group A with their description in Group B according to the vulnerability and sensitivity of receptors classification. So we are right now talking about sensitivity of receptors. What are receptors? That is the receiving environment. It could be biological components of the environment, it could be animals there, right? That's the environment that is going to be affected by your project or your intervention. Okay, we have uh, partial answers coming in. Okay, let's look at the answers, right? So when climatic factors have little influence on receptors, so that will be obviously, so they have very little influence, right? So that will be low vulnerability. When the receptor is directly dependent on prevailing climatic factors and reliant on their continuation or limited variability. So they are directly dependent, they're heavily dependent on the current condition, like whatever the correct condition of the environment is, the climatic factor is, they're so like they are dependent on its limited variability, as in their existence, their continuation is going to depend on this environment not changing much, right? Limited variation. That's what they mean. So that will be high vulnerability. Then the third one is when receptor demand dependent on some climatic factors but are able to tolerate a range of conditions. So that's moderate vulnerability, right? So we have P2, Q3, and R1, right? So this is the slide that highlights this. Yes, the answer is in fact D. You are right, sir. Right? Moving on to the next question. So this was a query that has been raised more than once in the discussion forum, right? So saying that the answers are sort of not coherent. So let's take a look at it. So this is something that we've already dealt with, right? So environment typically supporting a specific recognizable community. So that's a biotope, right? Study of ecosystems. So since it's a study, that's ecology. Conditions are needed to support a species or community of species or community of species in a particular location, right? Am I saying this wrong? Yeah, that's habitat. Right. Then self-sustaining functional system consisting of physical, chemical, and biological attributes. Right. So the answer is actually, like we already saw, the answer is actually C and not B. So this will be modified in the answer key. Don't worry about it. So this issue has been taken into consideration, right? So the answer is actually C. So it's P4, Q3, R1, and S2. Okay. This will reflect in the answer keys shortly. Moving on to the next question. State true or false. According to the IAIA, there are four key questions for scoping with respect to impact on climate and climate change. Is it true or false? Okay, we have an answer. So the answer is actually true. IAIA sort of gives these four key questions, that the proposal will directly or indirectly increase or decrease GHG emissions. The proposal may be beneficially or adversely affected by and vulnerable to climate change, either directly or indirectly. Climate change may affect other aspects of the environment that are potentially affected by the impacts of the proposal. Right. So it may affect other aspects. An objective of the proposal is to use impact assessment to identify alternatives and measures to mitigate and or adapt to climate change. So there are four key questions in the IAIA recommendation. Right. Sorry. Moving on to the next question. What among the below given is the approach for baseline study? So these are approaches for baseline study. One is listing approach, snapshot approach, dynamic baseline, all of the above. So this is regarding ecology again. Any answers? Okay, so this is actually taken directly from the slides again. These all three of these are approaches for baseline study. Okay, so the answer is all of the above. Okay, moving on to the next question. DAFOR or DAFOR is used for species abundant measures, right? So we use this for species abundant measures. What does DAFOR stand for? So D, is it dominant or deduction? A, is it abundant? Like I think A is sort of the same throughout. F is frequent. O, is it occasional or odd? And R, is it rare or reduced? Dominant or deduction. So we have two different answers. Let's see what the answer is, right? So this is the slide that mentions DAFOR. So DAFOR is dominant, abundant, frequent, occasional, and rare. So these DAFOR is actually a scale, right? Dominant is the highest proportion and rare is the least found, right? So these are all semi-quantitative abundance ratings. I'll sort of explain what they mean by that, right? So the answer is actually A. So in ecology, local abundance, right, is the relative representation of a species in a particular ecosystem. So this is the key. How much is a species represented in an ecosystem? So some species might be more, some species might be less, right? It is usually measured as the number of individuals found per sample, right? They usually take a sample and sort of count and say, oh, there are three of species A or four of species A. There is only one of species B, and there is like 10 members of species C, right? So which means 10 will be the highest one, uh, one will be the lowest one, right? So there are actually several methods for doing this. One is the semi-quantitative abundance rating. So we need not just go for semi-quantitative methods. There are two scales actually. One is the ACFOR scale and the other is the DAFOR scale. DAFOR is what we saw right now. So within DAFOR, there is a guidance note. So remember that it is a very rough measure, right? So we look at dominant is usually 50 to 100%, abundant is 30 to 50%, frequent is 15 to 30%, occasional is 5 to 15%, and rare is less than 5%. So this is a particular trust ka handout for their particularly looking at a churchyard, like a huge churchyard, right? But this is the Dapper scale. So it's a very rough calculation, and right, this is say you in practice dominant will be rarely used, right? More than 50% of the species being a particular species is quite rare. Abundant is the usual one, right? So they've sort of given guidelines as to how to rate in that particular handout. But this is like sort of representative of what the proportions usually are. So it's not such a strict, it's not a very accurate method. It's a very rough estimate. So this is the scale, right? I hope that's clear. Okay, moving on to the next question. So this was again a discussion forum query. Someone had raised that this answer is wrong. So let's see. So what is plotless sampling? Sampling is conducted within defined plots. Sampling is not conducted within defined areas. Sampling is conducted using quadrats. Sampling is conducted using circles. Any answers? Okay. Okay. Both of you are right. So, I mean, the original key that was given is correct, right? It is D. So, this is given here, plotless sampling, right? So, the answer is D. Let's take a look. So, plot based or quadrat technique. So, quadrat technique is when you have a rough, you know, um, a template of sorts that you keep. So, it's a plot based. You sort of define a plot, define an area, and then you sort of do your density counting, right? So you need a quad. If you look at this, defined plots, quadrats, circles, all of these are talking about a particular area being defined, right? So they all involve a plot. However, plotless sampling is when you use distances. There have been a lot of methods. Like according to this website, it's 8 to 10 methods. So this is from the University of Idaho's website. There are quite a lot of methods where we, sort of figure out the density. What changes rather what is standard, we sort of have a point and then we measure distances of this species from this particular point, and we estimate density using a formula, right? It could be point centered quarter, nearest neighbor, closest individual. These are some of the methods. Like they've given three basic examples. So using these distances, we take an average of these distances, right? And then we plug it into some equation to find out what we think the density is in a particular area, right? So we're trying to find out abundance, or how much species are there in a particular area, right? And one measure of abundance is density. Mind you, it's not the only measure. It's one of the measures of abundance, right? So I hope that's clear what plotless sampling is. Moving on to the next question. Say true or false. Some species have very limited dispersal ability, and such low mobility species are: one, unrestricted to remaining habitat patches, or two, unlikely to recolonize isolated habitat patches. Any responses? Okay, so the answer is actually false. Let me explain. So, ma'am has sort of mentioned this. There is no particular slide per se dealing with this. So, some species have limited dispersal ability, so they cannot disperse themselves very well, right? So, they are low mobility species. Say you have a huge area where a species is present, right? So, this species depends on everything in this area, right? Say, for example, this species is some sort of, say here also, there's some of them. Their pollination, say it's a plant, and their pollination depends on a particular bee or something, which is present usually in this area, right? Say it's not present. So what happens is, say it becomes two different patches and they lose contact, right? Here we end up having two different areas now. So this is one and the other is one. What happens is, in this isolated patch, they might be there, but here, say we don't have any pollination happening and these species die out, or somehow all of the species end up getting isolated here. They do not have means of spreading to their original extent, right? Originally, this entire ecosystem was acting as one. The problem with such things is, say some other species here, like some other species here was actually depending on this for something else, so some other, food or something, they will also die out, right? Because they won't have, say this is also a low mobility species, they won't cross this road and go, they might end up getting extinct. And this one might end up becoming limited in its geographic area. So they are actually restricted to remaining habitat patches, right? Or they are unlikely to recolonize isolated habitat. Yes, they cannot recolonize, right? So this is okay, but this part is wrong. They are actually restricted to remaining habitat patches, right? I hope that's clear. So say there is a third patch and this is an animal. They might not actually go back here if the construction happened when they were all here, right? Okay, moving on to the next question. What is the full form of PES? Is it payments for ecosystem services? Placement of ecosystem services? position of ecosystem services or pollutants of ecosystem services. So this was dealt with in one of the previous weeks as well. I think either week 3 or week 4. Okay, we have one answer. Any other responses? All right. The answer is actually payments for ecosystem services. So this is a concept where whenever we are considering how much a project is going to benefit or affect, what we do is ecosystem services, like it's like adding apples and oranges, right? We usually take everything in terms of money considerations. Here, if we cannot consider it in terms of money, so we sort of assign an economic value to these ecosystem services. So that's payments for ecosystem services, right? So, for example, take this one. So, say this particular community is, this was explained before as well. This community is actually maintaining this river, this forest. They're doing agriculture, which is bringing in food, everything. And the city is dependent on this. It's not just about, they might pay them back for the food, yes, but they are not really paying them back for the, cleanliness of the water. Without this community, this river might not be what it is here right now, or the air, or some sort of carbon sequestration is happening because this village maintains this forest, right? So these services are not really being paid for. So under PES, they pay back, right? They sort of pay back in some form. It could be cash, in kind, materials, technical assistance, even, right? Some form of technological improvement to their lives. So they pay back the communities in order for these services that they're maintaining, right? Because otherwise, these ecosystem services will not exist at all. I hope that's clear. Moving on to the next question, which was again part of the discussion forum query. Someone had raised that the answer given was wrong. So the question is state true or false. The area people need access to for an ecosystem service to be sustainable in terms of the level of benefit they need or depend is called a use shed. So the keyword is need access. Okay. So I guess the issue is, the answer is actually false. The thing is, use shed is area people use for getting a particular ecosystem service. So say there is a huge area, right? And there are people here in this settlement, and they need timber from here for something, and say they need a different kind of timber from here for something else. Okay. So say there is a railway crossing or some sort of development that comes here that has blocked them off from this part. What happens is now they have access to this. This is the use shed. They are able to use this, but they need access to this, right? This area is sort of marked off for them, right? This area is not accessible to them. This is a supply shed. It's not a use shed. So this is what they're currently using. This is what they want. So they need access to this. So this is not a use shed. This is a supply shed. So the answer is false. Be mindful of what keyword is being used, right? If they have access, then it is use shed. If they need access, it's a supply shed. I hope that's clear. Okay, moving on to the next question. What is the survey technique for large mammals, like counting large mammals? A. Radio tracking. B. Speed tracking. C. Snap traps. D. Nest tubes. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, we have two answers actually. Okay, all right. Both of you are right. So this was mentioned in this slide, right? So radio tracking or direct observation is another option. So radio tracking is the answer. The thing is, this is an example. So you have such a collar to do the radio tracking. It's especially useful if it's a migrant species, right? So in order to track, so this is sort of like the tracker that they have, right? This one. In order to, so they sort of install these on animals. They attach them and then they keep track of them. So this could be used for counts, right? And uh, this is an example. So this is a paper that talks about how it's not enough. For example, say this neck circumference is 21 centimeters almost, and say they are migrating for 4 months. These animals might actually become bigger, right? So we usually recapture to take away these tags. The thing is, between this time, you shouldn't strangle the animal also because of this presence. So they sort of have designed a band that expands with the animal. So that's just something I came across that was very interesting. Right? The thing is, it's these trackers that are not just used for survey purposes or counting purposes alone. They are also used to keep track of large mammals, like for example, elephants. So they track their movement in order to, reduce human-animal conflict. So if they have information as to where these elephants are, not just to save human life, but also to minimize interruption in their, elephant tracks and stuff. Say they do not usually come across a particular track, so we can have a stretch of road blocked off when they are moving in that direction, for example, so that they also are not threatened and they do not damage any human property or human lives for that matter. Okay, so that's the end of the session. I hope the discussions were useful. Are there any queries, any general queries? As usual, you can sort of get back to us if you want a different format or if you want something more from these sessions, right? We have 4 weeks left. Uh, there were a few queries from last week during the class that were raised that have not been resolved yet. And I'm also trying to figure out who will be posting the responses in the discussion forum. There is a bit of a gap. So we'll try to address that as soon as possible. But nonetheless, thank you for attending the sessions because they'll be very, very dry if there are no participants. So it keeps me also interested in taking class. And I know it's like precious time of yours. But thank you so much for joining me today. If there are no queries, I think we'll close the session. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good evening. If there are any other queries, you can post in the discussion forum.